For 113 days during the spring and summer of 1898, the United States was at war with Spain. The war happened despite the best efforts of each nation to avoid it. It happened because a fading empire clashed with an emerging empire, and because forces set in motion had become too powerful to resist. It was the most popular of all American wars. Never before had grassroots Americans been so ready to fight. Though the reasons for the conflict were obscure, 200,000 Americans sprang to their country's call in 1898. 379 would die in battle. Another 1,604 were wounded. Almost 4,000 soldiers would succumb to fever and disease. Though in a strategic sense, the Spanish-American War was an unabashed victory, as a military operation it was chaotic, mismanaged, and ultimately, perhaps unnecessary. Observing events from his post as ambassador to Great Britain, where distance obscured the worst examples of military mismanagement, Abraham Lincoln's former secretary, John Hay, judged it a splendid little war, begun with the highest motives, carried on with magnificent intelligence and spirit, favored by that fortune which loves the brave. The War of 1898 would best be remembered for the gallant enthusiasm of the fighting men, not the incompetence of a legion of bureaucrats. Long in coming but short in duration, our war with Spain had its beginnings in the long, simmering revolt of native Cubans against their Spanish overlords. American newspapers whipped up the war passion. Many correspondents who approached no nearer to Cuba than Key West, Florida, reported eyewitness accounts of the Spanish atrocities they never saw, relying on the exaggerated stories of Cuban insurgents. These yellow journalists fueled war fever with their propaganda, and the circulation of their newspapers soared. Meanwhile, jingoistic nationalists, hoping to oust Spain from her last holdings in the Western Hemisphere, increasingly upped the ante in a game of dare and counter-dare. America was experiencing the golden age of the daily newspaper, the only news medium then available. The reporter's prose made up for the lack of photojournalism with vivid and often fictional descriptions. Two of the yellowest of the yellow journals were the New York World, owned by Joseph Pulitzer, and the Journal, owned by William Randolph Hearst. These newspapers inflamed the war passion with their saber-rattling headlines, and when war came, the correspondents would be in the thick of the action. It was said that when the famous illustrator Frederick Remington, in Cuba under contract to William Randolph Hearst, informed his employer that there was no sign of war, Hearst cabled in response, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." The most celebrated journalist of his time, dashing war correspondent and New York socialite, was 34-year-old Richard Harding Davis. A tireless self-promoter, Davis expressed his belief that a code of gentlemanly conduct and chivalric honesty was the prerequisite of any writer who accepted the often dangerous assignment of reporting the news of the day. Davis' manner was cultured, his dress impeccable. His well-groomed good looks and love of adventure impressed men and charmed women. He was a celebrity in his own right. Part journalist, part soldier of fortune, Davis was sure to be on hand for a war with Spain. Another adventurous correspondent was Stephen Crane, whose 1895 novel, The Red Badge of Courage, had made him an overnight literary sensation. 8 years younger than Davis, Crane was, in personality and lifestyle, a diametric opposite. Slight, sickly and sallow-skinned, a chain smoker who experimented with opium and consorted with prostitutes, Stephen Crane seemed to relish a perverse pleasure in flaunting society's Victorian conventions, in crossing the line between propriety and decadence. Lauded for his gritty depiction of the Civil War in The Red Badge of Courage, Crane was determined to prove his own mettle under fire. And the manner in which he did so would cause even Richard Harding Davis to hold his shabby and unorthodox colleague in certain awe. All previous Cuban crises were overshadowed when the American battleship Maine cruised into Havana Harbor on a so-called courtesy call. On the night of February 15th, 1898, the Maine was ripped apart by a terrific explosion. 266 crewmen died. What caused the disaster was never precisely determined, but there is a strong body of evidence that an internal explosion, possibly in the coal bunkers, ignited the forward ammunition magazine, and that the Maine was blown up by an accident, not by Spanish terrorism. But all doubts were swept aside by a wave of war fever. The destruction of the Maine became, for Americans, an act of national symbolism, like the siege of the Alamo and the firing on Fort Sumter. The newspapers demanded, politicians demanded, and the public demanded that the United States avenge the outrage, that we go to war with Spain. A reluctant President William McKinley told a friend, "I have been through one war, and I have seen the dead piled up. I do not wish to see another." But, pressured by his party and cabinet, the president was unable to resist the public clamor for war. On April 19th, 1898, war was declared. Following the resolution of Congress, McKinley called for an army of 100,000 volunteers. From all over America, the eager and adventurous recruits responded. Following the footsteps of their fathers who had marched to war in 1861, young men north and south, east and west, donned blue uniforms and flocked to their colors. Everywhere, the bands played what had become a musical anthem for the warlike volunteers. There'll be a hot time in the old town tonight. By the thousands, they poured into improvised training camps and began to learn the demands of discipline, the intricacies of drill. Army life could be arduous. Occasionally, it could be fun. But most of all, these zealous patriots wanted to fight. A new national hero emerged when the news came from the Philippines that on May 1st, Admiral George Dewey had destroyed a Spanish fleet at Manila Bay, without any damage to his ships or serious casualties. This smashing victory bolstered the soaring confidence of the American public that this would be a quick and decisive war. Theodore Roosevelt, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, resigned to organize a volunteer cavalry regiment. An avid outdoorsman and erstwhile rancher in his own right, Teddy Roosevelt appealed to the territorial governors of Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma for recruits who were young, good shots, and good riders. Not only did cowboys, rangers, Indians, and assorted Westerners respond in overwhelming numbers, but socially prominent Easterners signed on as well, including men of money and power, polo players and athletes from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Roosevelt would serve as lieutenant colonel under regimental commander Leonard Wood, but the 1st Volunteer Cavalry became known and would go down in history as Roosevelt's Rough Riders. The riders are the toughest set of men I have ever seen, one New Jersey volunteer wrote home. They drink, gamble, and raise the devil generally. As a gesture of national reconciliation, former Union Major McKinley commissioned 2 former Confederate cavalry commanders as major generals of volunteers, Fighting Joe Wheeler and Robert E. Lee's nephew, Fitzhugh Lee. Command of the Cuban invasion force was assigned to 300-pound Brigadier General William R. Shafter. Pecos Bill was a Medal of Honor recipient for bravery in the Civil War and a veteran Indian fighter. Although most of Shafter's troops were regular Army men, many were raw recruits. Tampa, Florida was chosen as the assembly point for the invasion. While the soldiers squatted in their tent camps, lacking even the most essential supplies, many officers took up quarters in the Grand Tampa Bay Hotel. The hotel's saloon, dining hall, and spacious verandas soon became a reunion place for the former foes of the blue and gray. A rendezvous for grizzled officers of the regular Army who had spent 4 decades scattered over the once wild but now tamed western frontier. Correspondent Richard Harding Davis was on hand for this curious reunion.
During the early part of May, the myriads of rocking chairs on the long porches were filled with men. This was the rocking chair period of the war. Officers who had not met in years, men who had been classmates at West Point, men who had fought together and against each other in the last war, were gathered together, talking of how they would fight this war.
Though regular Army units and a few volunteer outfits like the Rough Riders carried Krag-Jorgensen rifles and carbines, most state volunteers were issued obsolete 1884 Springfield rifles, which still used old black powder cartridges. One soldier recalled, "This rifle, if properly directed, could knock down 2 men, the one it hit and the one who fired it." Nearly all the Spanish troops would be armed with one of the finest rifles available, the German Mauser. Mausers fired a smokeless cartridge, and like the Krags, utilized a 5-round magazine for repeating fire. Everyone seemed carried away by their enthusiasm to get to Cuba, to start the fighting. Army General-in-Chief Nelson Miles was overwhelmed by the chaos at Tampa and urged more cautious strategy, but he was unable to slow the war fever. Even so, Weeks stretched into months before the 17,000-man invasion force was ready to embark. When the troop loading finally took place, it was an unregulated free-for-all. Teddy Roosevelt, always aggressive, succeeded in getting his Rough Riders aboard a transport that had already been assigned to other units. When the ships were finally ready to depart, General Shafter was ordered to wait. For a week, 17,000 troops on 32 transports sweltered in wool uniforms in the Florida heat, without ice or fresh food, anchored in a sea of sewage. With heavily defended Santiago on Cuba's southeastern coast as its destination, Shafter's 5th Army Corps at last steamed away from Tampa on June 14th. The force consisted of 2 divisions commanded by Civil War veterans J. Ford Kent and Henry Lawton, plus an independent brigade of infantry, Joe Wheeler's division of dismounted cavalry, including the Rough Riders, and 4 batteries of field artillery. Landing an army in the face of an entrenched enemy is always a hazardous undertaking, made even more perilous when a large part of the army is barely trained. General Shafter decided to put the American forces ashore at Daiquiri, 18 miles east of Santiago. Confused as it was, the landing proceeded more like a beach party than a prelude to battle. Veteran war correspondent Richard Harding Davis was on hand, well-groomed and immaculately outfitted, as befit a society man turned scribe.
Soon the sea was dotted with rows of white boats filled with men bound about with white blanket rolls and with muskets at all angles. And as they rose and fell on the water and the newspaper yachts and transports crept closer, the scene was strangely suggestive of a boat race. No one slept that night, for until 2 o'clock in the morning, troops were still being disembarked in the surf. It was one of the most weird and remarkable scenes of the war, probably of any war. An army being landed on an enemy's coast at the dead of night, but with somewhat more of cheers and shrieks and laughter than rise from the bathers in the surf at Coney Island on a hot Sunday. The men still to be landed from the prison hulks, as they called the transport, were singing in chorus. The men on the shore were dancing around the campfires on the beach or shouting with delight as they plunged into the first bath they had offered in 7 days. And those in the launches, as they were pitched headfirst at the soil of Cuba, signalized their arrival by howls of triumph.
While officers tried to sort out the confusion at Daiquiri, Joe Wheeler was urging Shafter to press on immediately for the Spanish stronghold at Santiago. "We must get at them quick," the old Confederate said. "Nothing is gained by temporizing with the enemy. Let's go at them and have done with it." The road to Santiago left the coast at Siboney and ran inland through the foothills east of the city. Spanish General Antero Rubin had fallen back along this route in the early hours of June 23rd and was now dug in along the ridge of high hills bestride the road at a place called Las Guasimas. General Wheeler, living up to his fighting reputation, determined to attack the Spanish position early the next morning. From Siboney, a narrow jungle trail ran inland a few hundred yards to the west of the main Santiago road. Wheeler would send 500 Rough Riders up this trail, while he led the bulk of his troopers up the Santiago road. At a point near the Spanish position, the Rough Riders were to leave the trail and advance through the dense jungle to strike the Spaniards' right flank, while Wheeler attacked the left. 25-year-old Hamilton Fish, grandson of President Grant's Secretary of State, had been a star athlete at Columbia. Wealthy sportsman and New York socialite Ham Fish joined the Rough Riders as Sergeant of Troop L. "We are going to fight it out like true Americans," Fish told his parents. "We shall win, and you shall be proud of me." As the sound of combat escalated off to their right, the Rough Riders advanced through the jungle toward an unseen enemy that held the high ground at Las Guasimas. Captain Alan Capron, Sergeant Fish, and 6 soldiers from L Troop were in advance, moving down a narrow jungle path when Tom Isbell, a Cherokee from Indian Territory, shot and killed a lurking sharpshooter. An explosion of gunfire followed. The Rough Riders had walked into an ambush. Isbell went down with 7 wounds. Captain Capron was mortally wounded, and the others threw themselves prone and began to return fire. Hamilton Fish dropped down beside former cowboy Ed Culver, commenting, "Old boy, you've got a good place here," as he began cracking off rounds from his carbine. Suddenly, both men were staggered by a bullet that passed through Fish and went on to lodge in Culver's chest. Young Hamilton Fish was killed instantly, the first Rough Rider to die in battle. Young Stephen Crane was getting his first view of war at close range.
I know nothing about war, of course, and pretend nothing, but I have been enabled from time to time to see brush fighting, and I want to say here plainly that the behavior of these Rough Riders while marching through the woods shook me with terror as I have never before been shaken.
Photographer Burr McIntosh stumbled across the corpse of Hamilton Fish and another slain trooper. After taking a photograph of the 2 bodies, he later wrote, "I heard someone laughing. Looking to the right, about 15 feet, I saw a group apparently discussing the events of the day. I took a photograph of it, and then another to show the distance from the 2 bodies. The photographs were taken with a heart filled with resentful bitterness. It was all war, and time has shown me that one should be able to drink to the next one who dies. But I feel a resentment towards certain of those men who were joking with that boy's body lying within a few feet of them. A resentment which I never expect to be able to overcome." The group included Leonard Wood, Teddy Roosevelt, and Generals Lawton and Wheeler, plus the ever-present correspondent, Richard Harding Davis. Being carried to the rear was New York Journal reporter Edward Marshall, who was shot through the body near the spine. Of the fight at Las Guasimas, Marshall wrote, "I saw many men shot. Every one went down in a lump, without cries, without jumping in the air, without throwing up hands. They just went down like clods in the grass." There is much that is awe-inspiring about the death of soldiers on the battlefield. The man lives. He is strong. He is vital. Every muscle in him is at its fullest tension when suddenly, chug, he's dead. That chug of bullets striking flesh is nearly always plainly audible. I did not hear the bullet shriek that killed Hamilton Fish. I did not hear the bullet shriek which hit me. Chug came the bullet, and I fell into the long grass, as much like a lump as had the other fellows whom I had seen go down. There was no pain, no surprise. The tremendous shock so dulled my sensibilities that it did not occur to me that anything extraordinary had happened. It would take a week of regrouping and bringing up supplies and ammunition before any further advance could be made. A week in which the earlier confusion at Tampa and Daiquiri was repeated. In front of the little American army lay the last barrier before Santiago, the Sierra de San Juan, a heavily fortified range of hills 2 miles east of the city. General Shafter planned to send Kent and Wheeler's divisions in a frontal assault against the ridge, while detaching Lawton's division to attack the strategic fort and blockhouses at El Caney, 2 miles to the north. The twin battles of El Caney and San Juan Hill on July 1st, 1898, would decide whether the American invasion of Cuba would succeed or fail. It would not prove an easy task. The Battle of San Juan Hill would become so embroidered by legend that even many participants would later not be entirely sure just what happened. The torrid tropical day dawned with the elephantine Shafter prostrated by the heat. General Wheeler was also ailing, and his cavalry would go into action under General Samuel Sumner. Sumner's and Kent's divisions advanced in a close-packed column along a narrow, steamy jungle trail that crossed the Aguadores and San Juan rivers and on to a grassy meadow crisscrossed with Spanish barbed wire at the foot of San Juan Hill. While Sumner and Kent were preparing their frontal assault on the heights, General Lawton's division was already moving against the Spanish outpost at El Caney. At both points, the Americans underestimated the skill and courage of their enemy. The Spanish knew the trails their adversaries would have to travel, and had their artillery and the sights of their Mauser rifles trained upon them. An American observation balloon was sent up with 2 officers. The huge gas-filled bag floating overhead marked the progress of the Americans along the jungle path. It made an inviting target. The Spaniards unleashed a heavy fire at the balloon and the jungle underneath. The fusillade from the Spanish works staggered the 71st New York. The regiment stalled and refused to go forward, causing a bloody traffic jam in the column that followed. Some regular cavalry regiments reached the clearing at the end of the jungle trail and began to exchange fire with the Spanish on San Juan Hill. The Rough Riders emerged from the trail and filed to the right of the American line. They hunkered down under heavy fire and waited for further orders. Ahead was the heavily fortified enemy line on Kettle Hill, easternmost of the San Juan defenses. Colonel Charles Wyckoff's brigade of regulars pushed their way through the confused mass of men blocking the trail, splashed across the San Juan River, fanned out into a line, and started toward the deadly entrenchments on the heights. Colonel Wyckoff was shot down with a fatal wound, and his successor, Lieutenant Colonel William Worth, was riddled with 3 bullets. Bleeding from the arm and chest, Worth grabbed his orderly, Private John Keller. "Keller, just keep me on my feet." "It was hailing bullets and shrapnel shot," Private Keller recalled. "With the Americans, it was fire in advance, and cut more wire fence, dropping to our knees and stomachs when it was necessary. Our men continually cried, 'Show us those sons of bitches, for God's sake. Don't keep us up here to be shot without giving us a show.' And they cursed and raved because they could not see nothing to shoot at. Nothing but the cleared hilltop and what looked like a long mile of freshly throwed up earth." The wounded steadily poured to the rear to a makeshift hospital, which was not protected from the accurate Spanish fire.
There was no hiding from them. Their bullets came from every side. Their invisible smoke helped to keep their hiding places secret. And in the incessant shriek of shrapnel and the spit of the Mausers, it was difficult to locate the reports of their rifles. They spared neither wounded nor recognized the Red Cross. They killed the surgeons and the stewards carrying the litters and killed the wounded men on the litters.
I looked down into a miserable huddle of wounded men, and there I saw Reuben McNabb, my classmate of years before, with a hole in his lung. "Well, they got me," he said, greeting. Usually they said that. I had looked upon 500 men with stolidity, or with a conscious indifference which filled me with amazement. But the apparition of Reuben McNabb, my schoolmate, lying there in the mud with a hole through his lung, awed me into stutterings, set me trembling with a sense of terrible intimacy with this war, which I could have believed was a dream almost.
For even the bravest men, the long wait under fire was an ordeal. Rough Rider Captain William Bucky O'Neill, was convinced that an officer ought never take cover. That daring enemy fire served to encourage the men. The captain from Arizona was a true Wild West character, a gambler, miner, sheriff. He strolled up and down in front of the troops, smoking a cigarette and calming his men, while they begged him to take cover. O'Neill smiled and said, "The Spanish bullet isn't made that will kill me." Seconds later, a bullet entered his open mouth and blew out the back of his head.
The situation was desperate. Our troops could not retreat, as the trail for 2 miles behind them was wedged with men. They could not remain where they were, for they were being shot to pieces. There was only one thing they could do: go forward and take the San Juan Hills by assault.
Yes, they were going up the hill. It was the best moment of anybody's life. An officer said to me afterward, if we had been in that position and the Spaniards had come at us, we would have piled them up so high the last man couldn't have climbed over. But up went the regiments with no music, save the ceaseless, fierce crashing of rifles.
While the Rough Riders and regular cavalry units moved against Kettle Hill, the American left flank, General Hamilton Hawkins' brigade started the advance on San Juan Hill. Hawkins and his aide, Lieutenant Jules Garochet Ord, were ahead of everyone, the white-haired general waving his hat and shouting, "Come on, come on," until he fell wounded. Lieutenant John Parker's Gatling gun battery was chattering overhead as Hawkins' men began their jogging advance up the high ground. And 500 bullets per minute at a range of 600 yards caused numbers of Spanish soldiers to flee from their bullet-swept positions. The 3rd, 6th, and part of the 10th Cavalry swung into line on Hawkins' right and joined in the charge on San Juan Hill. Black Color Sergeant George Berry, a 31-year veteran of the 10th Cavalry, was carrying his regiment's flag when the color bearer of the 3rd Cavalry fell beside him. He picked up the banner and sprinted on, a flag in each hand. Lieutenant Parker was awed by the bravery of the Rough Riders as, with Teddy Roosevelt in the lead, they crested Kettle Hill and pushed on across the intervening valley for the heights of San Juan. "They fought like regulars and endured like Spartans," Parker said. "They hung on like bulldogs and charged like demons." All along the line of Kent's division, the Americans pressed on with a cheer. "We went up that hill yelling and screaming like Indians," stated one soldier. "I yelled because the other fellas yelled," an infantryman said. "We kept going up, shooting from our magazines."
The action at San Juan on July 1st was, particularly speaking, a soldier's battle. No doubt when history begins to grind out her story, we will find that many a thundering, fine, grand order was given for that day's work. But after all, there will be no harm in contending that the men took the hill chiefly because they knew they could take it, some having no orders and others disobeying whatever orders they had. We owe the success to the splendid gallantry of the American private soldier.
The boys went on, yelling and hurrahing and cursing the Spaniards, a 6th Cavalryman remembered. When a man fell dead, his shirt was drawn up over his face to let the surgeons know their services were needed elsewhere. Army Chaplain Dwight Gallup found himself in the midst of the bullet-swept advance up San Juan Hill. "I could not help taking part in the fight," he said. "When our men began to reel under the concentrated Spanish fire, I felt the American rise in me, and tearing the red cross off my arm, I snatched up the gun and cartridge belt of one of our men and went to shooting just like the rest of them." Within minutes, the chaplain fell severely wounded. "I saw some hard fighting during the rebellion," said Colonel Harry Egbert of the 16th U.S., "but I never saw anything to compare with that gallant dash up San Juan Hill. When I was shot, I dropped in my tracks and my men went right on without me." Through the high grass, across an open valley to the foot of the heights, the Americans pressed on. Near the foot of the hill, we ran into some wire fences, an officer of the 9th Infantry recalled. Some officers had fence posts in their hands, breaking the wire. Men used their rifle butts, others rushed against the posts and bore whole sections down. The hill rose at an angle of 45 degrees, but the men went up like antelopes. Lieutenant Ord led a handful of 16th infantrymen over the Spanish lines to the westernmost point of the defenses. "Don't shoot the wounded men," Ord shouted. "Make them prisoners." The words were no sooner out of his mouth when a wounded Spaniard shot the lieutenant dead.
I have seen many illustrations and pictures of this charge on the San Juan Hills, but none of them seem to show it just as I remember it. I think the thing which impressed the one most, when our men started from cover, was that they were so few. It seemed as if someone had made an awful and terrible mistake. One's instinct was to call them to come back. You felt that someone had blundered and that these few men were blindly following out some madman's order. It was not heroic then. It seemed merely terribly pathetic. There were a few men in advance, bunched together, and creeping up a steep, sunny hill, the top of which roared and flashed with flame. Behind these first few, spreading out like a fan, were single lines of men, slipping and scrambling in the smooth grass, moving forward with difficulty as though they were wading waist-high through water. It was a miracle of self-sacrifice, a triumph of bulldog courage, which one watched breathless with wonder. But the blue line crept steadily up and on, and then, near the top, the broken fragments gathered together with a sudden burst of speed. The Spaniards fired a last volley and fled before the swift-moving wave that leaped and sprang up after them.
As the fight raged at Kettle and San Juan Hills, an equally bloody fight unfolded 2.5 miles to the northeast at El Caney. General Henry Lawton, hard-drinking Civil War veteran, Indian fighter, and Medal of Honor winner, had 4 brigades, nearly 7,000 men advancing to the attack on El Caney. But the Spanish position was proving a hard nut to crack. Inch by inch, the regulars pushed their way closer to the enemy earthworks, then made a rush for the barbed wire that fringed the rifle pits. All the while, Captain Alan Capron's battery pounded the Spanish positions, the captain grimly determined to avenge the death of his son and namesake, killed at Las Guasimas. "We fired into the underbrush," said a black soldier of the 25th U.S. "Balls flew like bees, humming as they went. The only thing left was to go ahead or die. We preferred to go ahead." "The bullets were tearing around us on all sides," said Private William Knipes of the 7th U.S. in General Adna Chaffee's brigade. "I felt 2 of them ping across my belt. The barbed wire fence was a death pit. We were mowed down there like sheep." Knipes staggered on with 6 wounds till a bullet through the neck brought him down. New York Journal correspondent James Creelman, charging forward with Chaffee's brigade, was shot through the shoulder just as he reached the Spanish breastworks. "I felt as if I'd received a blow with the fist," he recalled. "It whirled me half around, and the terrible velocity of the bullet actually burnt the flesh black as it left the body." After the first trenches had been cleared, the fighting went on for control of the stone fort and blockhouses that anchored the Spanish position. 35 Spanish soldiers held one blockhouse until all were killed, some in hand-to-hand combat. By late afternoon, the tough Spanish defenders had given way all along the line, falling back 800 yards or more to a second ring of defenses closer to Santiago. But the Americans could not rest on their laurels. A hail of Spanish artillery fire zeroed in on the captured ridge. "Our men drew their bayonets," one regular said, "and with tin cups, meat cans, and bare hands began to dig like gophers." The fighting was still heavy as the Spanish troops continued their fearful resistance. The thin line of American troops was by no means sure it could hold its position against a Spanish counterattack. There was great confusion among the Americans. Regiments were completely intermingled: white regulars, black regulars, rough riders. Scattered throughout were the correspondents, risking their lives for a story. Climbing up past the American and Spanish dead to obtain a closer view of the battle was portly Frederick Remington, the Western artist. The air was absolutely crowded with Spanish bullets, Remington reported. The shrapnel came screaming over. A shell struck in front of me, which jolted my nerves, and I beat a masterly retreat, crawling rapidly backwards.
The American battery thundered behind the men with a shock that seemed likely to tear the backs of their heads off. The Spanish shrapnel came swirling and swishing in supernatural velocity. The noise of the rifle bullets broke in their faces or sped overhead in swift, cruel spitting. And at the front of the battle sound, as if it were simply music, was beginning to swell and swell until the volleys rolled like a surf.
I was under cover from the fire of the enemy, which was so heavy that only one of our troop along the entire line of the hills was returning it. But Stephen Crane paraded up and down in full sight of the Spanish riflemen, dressed in a conspicuous white raincoat. He appeared as cool as though he were looking down from a box at the theater. General Wood and I were lying at Crane's feet, and Wood ordered him to lie down, for he was drawing fire. Crane pretended not to hear and moved farther away, still peering over the hill with the same interested expression. Wood told him for a second time that if he did not lie down, he would be killed, but Crane paid no attention. So, in order to make him take shelter, I told him he was not trying to impress us with his courage by doing that. He then dropped to his knees, as I hoped he would, and we breathed again.
From our line could be seen a long, gray Spanish entrenchment. From it floated no smoke, and no men appeared there. But it was making a noise like a million champagne corks. The army was dusty, disheveled, and indescribably dirty. Its hair matted to its forehead with sweat, and its shirts glued to its back with the same. The army was thirsty, hungry, and weary from its bundles and its marches and its fights. It sat down on the conquered crest and felt satisfied. Well, hell. Here we are.
The battle was won. Most of the regular Army troops had been impressed by Roosevelt's volunteers. "They're full of grit," said a third infantryman, "and would just as leave bite the dust as a piece of beefsteak. We regulars, we're proud of 'em." The bravery of the black regulars had been equally notable, though they would fail to get the press coverage Roosevelt's men did. "We must never forget the colored troops," stated a soldier of the 2nd U.S. "If it had not been for the 10th Cavalry, there would be not a Rough Rider left today. They did desperate and brave work, and we all admire them." Correspondent Stephen Bonsall was equally euphoric, reporting, "It is a fact that the services of no 4 white regiments can be compared with those rendered by the 4 colored regiments, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, and the 24th and 25th Infantry." In America's bloodiest day of the war, 18 officers and 117 men had been killed, 111 officers and 686 men wounded, a total of 932 casualties. Spanish losses totaled 595, including 2 generals. Linares, the senior Spanish commander, had been wounded, and Vara del Rey, the defender of El Caney, killed. As darkness fell over the captured trenches, 71st New York Private Benjamin Crane scrawled a note to his mother to let her know he was still alive. "One has to go through it to know what a terrible thing it is," the private wrote. "If I ever thanked my Heavenly Father, it was after the fight tonight." Before the Americans lay the city of Santiago, yet the moment of triumph was scarcely one to savor. General Shafter was not sure he could hold his advanced position with his thin line against a Spanish counterattack. By morning of July 3rd, Shafter felt the defenses of Santiago were still too strong for him to deal with. And with heavy casualties, ammunition and supply problems, Shafter was considering pulling his army back 5 miles to reorganize and refit. At the same time, he sent a message to the Spanish commander, General Toral, demanding Santiago's surrender and threatening to shell the city at point-blank range. As the negotiations dragged on, the most feared enemy, disease, began to take toll of the sunburned and ragged troops hunkered down in the trenches at Santiago. A New York Rough Rider wrote home, "The slightest thing brings on dysentery here, and yellow fever catches everybody." The deciding moment came that day when the Spanish fleet tried to escape the blockade of Santiago harbor. It was no match for Admiral Winfield Scott Schley's warships, which destroyed the Spanish vessels as they emerged. 6 Spanish ships were gutted, while only 1 American sailor lost his life. After this disaster, it was as clear to the Spaniards as to the Americans that the campaign in Cuba would soon be over. General-in-Chief Nelson Miles had arrived to press Shafter's negotiations. 22,700 Spanish defenders would lay down their arms. On July 17th, the Stars and Stripes were raised over Santiago. Nelson Miles was already on his way to Puerto Rico, where his expeditionary force waged a short and victorious campaign.
Puerto Rico was a picnic. The army advanced with the precision of a set of chessmen. The reason the Spanish bull gored our men in Cuba and failed to touch them in Puerto Rico was that Miles was an expert matador. There was more careful preparation and forethought exhibited in Puerto Rico than was shown in their entire campaign against Santiago.
Less than 4 months after war had been declared, the United States signed a peace protocol ending hostilities with Spain. Peace came differently to different men. In Puerto Rico, one artilleryman on the point of firing his field piece swore angrily. Another threw his hat in the air and cried, "Thank God, now I won't get killed." Within 2 years of the American victory, Stephen Crane was dead, his frail body racked by tropical fever and tuberculosis. Short though his life was, Stephen Crane was posthumously elevated to a place of greatness in American literature. Richard Harding Davis sought more wars and adventures in the years following the Spanish-American conflict, but lasting fame was destined to elude this gentleman correspondent in favor of his unconventional rival. The war was over for Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. They were shipped home and disbanded, only to live in history. It would be a short path for Theodore Roosevelt from San Juan Hill to the White House. For many soldiers, the fighting and dying would continue for 4 long years as U.S. troops waged a brutal jungle war against Filipino insurrectionists. The new American empire would not be won without bloodshed or controversy. An expansionist move swept the country. America had gained an appetite for overseas acquisitions. As one senator put it, "Where the flag once goes up, it must never come down." The dawning of the 20th century would see the United States overseeing its new protectorates, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Hawaiian Islands, and the Philippines. America's once cherished isolation was now gone forever. A century later, the legacy of the Spanish-American War remains.
when the main was sunk in February 1898, I said to myself, what if we're going to have war? In April, we declared war. We went down to the 71st National Guard, New York Armory, and I told her, a lie, I said I was 18 years old, and my father didn't say anything. And he consented. We had to go to Tampa. There were two ships. One was named Vigilancia, and the other was named the Segurancia. Now the Rough Riders, Teddy Roosevelt, get the best ship, of course. He was there first. And we took this old ship to Vigilancia. And as the Rough Riders landed at the next town, and they were ambushed, that is support. Every regiment when they came, I laid this letter. They have sentries, and beyond the sentries, a group of men which they called support. Now their support was attacked. Now, that morning, and that's the first morning there, we were sent to help them. We had to go up a hill and a winding path around. Now, as we took the winding path, we met some of the Rough Riders passed us the other way with bloody hands and bloody feet, bloody faces. They were on the way to the Chimney, where we had a doctors and doctors' tent and so forth. So finally we turned back. It was too late. Now we went into the jungle, but we couldn't. There's so much undergrowth. We couldn't have a formation there of the regiment. Now in that jungle there was a good part and a bad part. The bad part was there seemed to be a part of a roof, and there was a safe place and a dangerous place. We had one man shot, and I helped bury him. It was a nasty job. We were just wrapped the poor fellow in a blanket and took a hole, put him in the shovel down Styple. That was the burial. Finally got out of the jungle there, and we went squad by squad over this little river and gotten back to the enemy. Meantime, they were running. And I remember as we arrived, our little squad arrived there, Colonel Roosevelt, he said, oh, every time we had a sort of detail there, they would say, the ones that were already at the front would cheer them. And Teddy Roosevelt was right next to us. He says, don't cheer, man, shoot. It was not a hill, it was just a little slope. And at the top of that slope was a blockhouse. So he ran, dispatches ran out of the blockhouse. We were there 3 days and 3 nights. Occupied those trenches. Didn't have our clothes off. Didn't have much to eat. And on the 9th of July, the Spaniards surrendered. Then come the time. We were worn out. I was a young kid. I just obeyed orders. That's all I did.
Yeah.
I obeyed orders. I didn't do anything to that I did great, not to be the sole survivor of 27,000 men. I can see the 27,000 men. It's hard to believe they're all gone.